Hi, and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything happening in public policy, politics, everything you want to know. Thanks for joining us. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of CJ. This time we're back in Raleigh. Thanks for watching those ones from Chicago. I really feel like we got a lot out of it. Really interesting deep dive into what we learned from all the shutdowns. Now we're moving back to weekly news. A lot going on this week. Joining us this week, we have Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation on the couches with us, and Teresa Opeka, writer for Carolina Journal, and of course David Larson, our opinion editor at Carolina Journal, and Alex Baltziger, who is covering the state legislature for CJ. Check out carolinajournal.com. You can see everybody's writing and work there. We're going to wrap it all up for you here. But I got to tell you, the temperatures are running really, really hot at the state legislature. If you are working down there or following what's going on, tempers are flaring. People are not having fun anymore. Also, North Carolina's highest court, the North Carolina Supreme Court, has a new associate justice. We'll be talking about that because former Associate Justice Mike Morgan has decided to jump in the Democrat primary for governor. Meantime, the Capitol Broadcasting Company has issued an opinion column asking the governor to usurp legislative power when it comes to the budget and lots of other things. We've got so much to cover, so let's jump right in. Lots going on. Alex, give us a quick update on what's going on down at the legislature.
So we still don't have a budget. The House and Senate.
We have a budget. We just don't have a new budget.
We have a budget.
Right.
We have no new budget.
Right.
That's a good distinction there.
Yeah.
But obviously there's a lot riding on the new budget that
Sure.
could come out. School choice, Medicaid expansion. There's a couple of really big ticket items in this budget.
Right.
And something that's sort of messied the waters a little bit, or muddied the waters, has been these casinos.
Sure.
And some of this gambling language that is going into the budget. And then there's been a big debate as to whether or not that should go into the budget. The Senate really wants it. Mm-hmm. The House is interested, but took a vote and basically did not meet the threshold that they're setting for how many Republicans need to want this for it to get into the budget.
Sure.
And there's been some debate about that too, because Speaker Moore had allegedly set the threshold at 37 votes, which would be a slight majority of Republicans, but he has moved that to 61 votes, which would be enough for Republicans to be a complete majority, not a supermajority, but a majority of the House. And so there's been some back and forth, some he said that, he said this,
Sure.
Coming from both sides, and it seems like there's been a number of miscommunications, but budget negotiations seem like they were breaking down for a little bit there. I think that's caused a lot of stress down on Jones Street, but
the stress is high.
The stress is high, tensions are high, the Senate's not happy with the House
Sure.
is not happy with the Senate.
Colin Campbell, who also covers the state legislature with you, had some interesting tweets. He pointed out one that they just decided they're going to just empty the calendar, right?
Yeah, so there's been some of that. There's been some things that have gone by the wayside and gotten caught up in these negotiations and
Sure.
some of this tension here. But yeah, it has been interesting. Another thing is
and then they just called it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
They said they're just not going to do it.
So
that was Colin's other tweet, right?
That's right. So they're gonna push it back. There was a lot of hope this week that the budget might come out. I was a little bit skeptical of that, but
Sure.
It ended up where nothing came out of this week.
Wow.
So they are gonna. I know Speaker Moore and Senate Leader Phil Berger are both meeting constantly to try to work something out, and so negotiations have not broken down completely. They are still meeting and trying to work something out.
Was everybody there this week?
No, there were, so on the House side at least, I don't know what the count was on the Senate side, but there were 23 members gone.
Okay.
Last week they'd had several caucus meetings, the Republicans did.
Sure.
But this week it didn't seem like they even had the ability to have those caucus meetings because such a large chunk of the members were gone. I think there were 22 Republicans missing on Tuesday.
Wow, we'll be following it. What are you following in this process, David? It's been a lot going on.
I'm just looking at kind of the reactions to all this
Sure.
from people. It seems like there's some frustration. I mean, the Republicans have gotten a lot of really big things done over the last few years. They've
Right.
had a lot of success. They've looked pretty well put together. I think some people, even I've seen some grumbling on Twitter and other places from Republicans just saying, you know, this doesn't necessarily look good to have such difficulty between the House and the Senate on coming
Sure.
together on a budget. Generally you try to get this done in July, and then it's gone to August and now into September, and there's some doubts whether it gets done at all, which,
Sure.
if it doesn't, then we kind of stay with last budget's levels, and it's not the end of the world, but it just looks a little chaotic, I think, to a lot of people. And the casinos part, it seems, people are wondering why that's such a big deal that it seems like it might be the crux of what will blow up the negotiations, and it wasn't something on everybody's radar, I think, a year ago, or when everybody's thinking about this session, is
Sure.
we got to get the casinos casinos in different parts of the state in there. So that's kind of what I'm hearing and thinking about on that. But.
And part of this is a math question too, because it all depends on whether, funny enough, the ball is now a little bit in Cooper's court, because if only a simple majority in both chambers pass the legislation and approve of it, then Cooper has the power to veto it completely.
Right.
And if all the Republicans were on board, they have supermajorities. And so the casinos have sort of muddied the waters there as to vote count, because there's a lot of Republicans that don't want to vote for a budget that contains casinos. I don't know whether Cooper will veto the budget or not. It seems like he's likely to, especially in its current form.
Okay.
He's indicated that a few different times. But one of the poison pills in this budget for Cooper, and remember, Medicaid expansion's on the line. So if Cooper vetoes the budget, he's vetoing Medicaid expansion, which is one of his biggest projects and goals that he's had since he's ran for governor.
Right.
But one of the poison pills potentially is the school choice legislation. I don't know if Cooper can overcome that, but it is interesting that the school choice part is in the budget, because it could be pulled out as a separate bill and run separately, and Republicans have the votes. They have supermajorities that could pass it separately. So the math is getting interesting, and I think that goes into the calculus of how they're thinking about this.
Right. So, Mitch, I'm actually going to come to you about this. Talk to me about how this isn't that we're going to have a budget or a shutdown, right? There was a law passed that says we're just operating under the old one.
Right. It's actually 7 years ago that when the General Assembly and a Republican governor at the time finished a budget a little bit later than they wanted to, they decided to come back and pass a law within the budget that said if there's no new budget approved at the end of the 2-year budget cycle, the old budget provisions remain in place.
Okay.
And so that's one reason why you're allowed to have these ongoing negotiations, is because it doesn't shut anything down. No one gets a raise. You don't see any of the tax cuts that they like to see, but everything under the old budget level continues in place. So that's one reason why they're able to move forward. A couple of other observations I think that are important about this. People watching this show, all of us, the people who are dependent on what happens at Jones Street, city employees, are all paying a lot of attention to this.
Sure.
A lot of other people in North Carolina don't have any idea this is going on, doesn't affect them, and I think that's one reason the General Assembly can get away with this. They aren't really hearing a lot from the people back home about, why aren't you getting this done?
Right.
It's only the people who really care about state government. And the second thing is, this is a problem of the legislature's creation. Democrats are complaining about Republicans, but Democrats had these problems too in the past when they were in charge. It would take them months to finish a budget, sometimes not until deep into the fall. I think our colleague Donald Bryson told me that the first year that Roy Cooper was the chairman of a budget committee in the state Senate, the budget was finalized in October. Oh. So he really doesn't have a lot to say about their delays in this case. But I think that what this points out is that the General Assembly as a whole could have finished the budget if the members had told Speaker Moore and Phil Berger, we're not going to mess with this anymore.
Right.
Finish your work. But they have entrusted so much power to the leadership and sat back that now they're in a position where they basically have to let those two fight it out amongst themselves, and then they'll finally get a budget. This is something they could solve on their own if they decided, look, we've got the votes, we're going to pass a budget, you finalize it, and then we'll vote on it. But they're just letting the leaders do what they want to do.
That's really interesting. Now, what are you hearing from Cooper's office? I know you're covering the executive branch. What's he saying about this process?
I haven't heard really too much about it. I mean,
Right.
I take that back. There was some rumblings this past week, he said, about vetoing it.
Right.
But as Alex touched on, and we all know that the Medicaid expansion is his baby, quote unquote. He really pushed for it. There was this big, ceremony when he signed it when they all came to an agreement. So it's going to be very hard to believe he's going to veto that and have that go out the window, plus everything else. But it's not a bad look. It's not a good look for either side right now.
It really isn't, David. It looks like this is not a good look. But now we have media outlets jumping in and saying, "Well, the governor needs to step in."
Yeah, amidst, as Mitch said, it's chaos a little bit, but it's something that a lot of people in the rest of the state aren't seeing per se, and that other Democrat administrations or legislatures have done as well. But I think what I was looking at, the Capitol Broadcasting had an editorial that a lot of people took note of because it's pretty extreme in its language.
I think we have a quick quote from it.
It was published on WRAL. And basically what they're calling for, they're saying this is kind of evidence of chaos, and it's an emergency now. And because of that emergency, Governor Cooper should declare it an emergency and then pass Leandro funding for education, which is a very big, expansive plan, or implement Medicaid expansion by himself, and give raises to the teachers and administrators across the state. Basically, he should just sort of rule as a dictator and send the legislature, put the legislature to the side. And I guess for me, it kind of, you can reminisce on the COVID emergency, state of emergency that went for 888 days. And maybe some of the media are pining for that, that kind of power that Cooper had back in that time, where he could kind of decide which businesses can be open and when the schools can. Because since then he's lost, from that high of power that he had, he's come down to really not have much at all. So
and remember, in that case, he had that power because of legislation passed by the General Assembly. Now, he may have interpreted it wrong, but it was the Emergency Management Act, an act of the General Assembly that gave him that power. It wasn't just, I'm going to step in and do it myself.
It gave him the power to declare a state of emergency that I think people in the legislature didn't quite like how he used that power, and ended up passing, I think, House Bill 264 that went live at the beginning of this year, which in order for him to extend an emergency past 30 days, he has to have the Council of State and the legislature be on board with that. So, that would make, the Capitol Broadcasting editorial not really applicable or enforceable, because in order to do something like the Leandro plan or Medicaid expansion, those are complicated and would take more than 30 days to implement. So it's not really actionable.
State of emergency, but what they really mean is a rule by executive order, a dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's something that I think you kind of noticed that trend across the country, though, a little bit on the left, where they want to call things an emergency. So the CDC, after the George Floyd riots and all that, they declared racial injustice a public health emergency. And then, a lot of people talk about climate emergency, where you want to get around certain things because of climate change. New Mexico, you had the governor there declare a gun violence emergency, where we no longer have to pay attention to the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which even Democrats were calling that out, like that's lawless. So it does seem an element of lawlessness to, if you can declare something a state of emergency, you get around a lot of the checks and balances of the normal functions of government and just get to implement what you want. So, but in reality, Medicaid expansion was something that's been talked about since Obamacare was passed. And now that the details of finally doing it a decade later are getting finalized, all of a sudden it's an emergency. In that final time, or, you saw Cooper was out in the at Biltmore Estate, sitting there with CNBC about how great North Carolina's doing. We're the top in business. People are flooding here. So it's a little disingenuous to go from that kind of North Carolina's this great place, and then you have a little bit of trouble with budget negotiations, and suddenly we're a banana republic that he needs to step in. So
shape policy. What was the legislative reaction to that kind of claim that the executive branch should just usurp the legislative?
Yeah, I don't think they'd be very happy about that. Like you said, they have put restrictions on how a state of emergency can go about. I would be curious to see if they start looking at defining what a state of emergency is. Because I think it's fairly broad. Like Cooper can kind of say, oh, we're in a state of emergency over education, we're in a state of emergency over this or that. So I would be curious to see if they start putting some real concrete definitions onto what a state of emergency can be.
Sure.
But if it has to be about, the weather or not, then they can, climate change then, or,
It would have
there's
to be
ways
broad,
to.
but yeah, not too specific. But
Right.
yeah, it does get tricky. I would be curious to see.
Right. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like you were saying about state of emergency, everything being declared a state of emergency, it's kind of like everything be declared breaking news in the media.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, I think they said they started that with 9/11. Now you're breaking news about every little thing. There's a crawl going across the screen.
Right.
It loses its effectiveness.
Sure.
So, you're
We've
like,
inoculated people against an emergency.
yeah, right, exactly. You're like, yeah, okay, whatever.
Very
So,
interesting.
but yeah, that's the thoughts on that. But yeah, you can't have a dictatorship in the U.S. I mean, but
Right.
it seems all the media, mainstream media, wants to go that way. In fact, I'm getting a little off topic. They're talking now about the Biden impeachment from the House.
Right.
They're saying that now they are sending out memos to New York Times, all the mainstream media. Hey, you got to start criticizing the Republicans now because they want to look away from here. Don't look behind the curtain.
Sure.
They're kind of doing that. So same kind of thing. They want to have that dictatorship. They want to have that kind of ruling.
Right, it loses its meaning.
Exactly.
So, Mitch, we're adding fuel to fire. I mean, and well, first, do you have any thoughts on this thing with Cooper?
Yeah,
What do
it's
you think?
disappointing that Capitol Broadcasting would show
Sure.
such disrespect for the way that our government operates.
Right.
You have an executive branch, there's a legislative branch and a judicial branch. The legislative branch does the budget.
Right.
Whether you like what they do or not, it's their role. The governor has a role in that he can veto it, but it's not his role to come in and say, we're going to spend this on this, we're going to spend X on this.
Right.
The judicial branch has said that the power of the purse belongs with the legislative branch.
Sure.
And it's disappointing that Capitol Broadcasting would basically feed into the left-wing fringe narrative rather than just say, criticize the General Assembly for the fact that it is taking so long to finish a budget. That's legitimate criticism.
Sure.
But this editorial is just way outside of the mainstream.
Yeah, sure. So you've been following pretty closely the North Carolina Supreme Court. Bring us up to date on what's happened this week. So we had some big news coming.
Yeah, very big news. We learned back earlier this year that Justice Michael Morgan, who is near the end of his term, he's more than 6 years into his term, said he was not going to run for re-election, which meant that we knew there was going to be an open seat. And then he announced not too long ago that he was going to step down from the post in the first full week of September. He gave a little bit of advance notice of that. And once that happened, then we knew that Governor Cooper would be able to appoint someone to replace Morgan. Morgan is a Democrat, Cooper is a Democrat. Everyone expected that Cooper would appoint another Democrat, and he did, after having appointed Allison Riggs, former lawyer from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, left of center advocacy group, having appointed her to the Court of Appeals late last year. He reached back into that court and appointed her to be the new Justice of the Supreme Court. You see an image right there of Governor Cooper. Allison Riggs is to his left. Carolyn Thompson is the woman to his right, and she is going to take Riggs' place on the Court of Appeals. So he announced those at the same time. Then the day after this announcement, Mike Morgan did what has been talked about and speculated. Our good friend Dallas Woodhouse has been talking about this for a while, about Mike Morgan deciding to run for governor in the Democratic nomination, which means that Attorney General Josh Stein will have at least some competition in that primary. Another interesting note about the Allison Riggs, before we move on to another judicial item, is that because she left the Court of Appeals, the first day of the resumed state Supreme Court oral arguments, she wasn't there. Her seat was empty because she was wrapping up her work on the Court of Appeals.
Sure.
And we learned that one of the reasons that happened was a bunch of decisions that she had to write or was involved in came out that day, on Tuesday. Two biggies. One was on a case dealing with the Safe Child Act, which was an act the General Assembly passed in 2019. It opened up a 2-year window for victims of alleged child sexual abuse to be able to file lawsuits even after the statute of limitations had filed. So basically, this is adults wanting to file suits about abuse that happened when they were kids. A 3-judge trial court panel had declared that law unconstitutional, but now the Court of Appeals, in an opinion written by Allison Riggs and released on her last day in a 2-1 split, revived that law, meaning that it revived the lawsuits. Her other big ruling on the last day was in a public records dispute between WBTV and the city of Charlotte over whether Charlotte could refuse to turn over public records because they were held by a third-party contractor and not by the city. Basically, the unanimous appeals court in that decision, written by Riggs, said, no, that's a guise, that's a way to keep the public from getting the documents. The city does have to turn over the documents, and they're going to have to pay WBTV's lawyers for all of this mess. So that was the biggie on the court front. And then one other judicial thing we're going to talk about before we throw it over is there's a big federal lawsuit over voter ID.
Right.
And we learned this week from Magistrate Judge Patrick Auld that the voter ID critics are not going to be able, we see him right there with a picture of a fine-looking hand holding a driver's license.
Familiar.
Yeah, familiar-looking hand.
Can't see the whole number of the driver's license.
Exactly. There was a point to that. The judge said, no, you can't reopen discovery in this case. Discovery in the case closed back in 2020. And basically, without coming out and saying it, he said that these voter ID critics were acting in bad faith because at various stages in this 5-year lawsuit, they have either tried to speed up the case or slow down the case. And they've taken different stances based on what would help them. And in this case, reopening the discovery would help them rather than following what courts normally do. And he said, no, you're not going to be able to do that. So that was a major development in that case. And I should remind people who think, voter ID, I think we need voter ID this year. Yes. Voter ID is in place this year. This federal lawsuit, though, could affect whether we have it going forward in 2024.
Okay, so in asking for more discovery, that means that they'd have the opportunity to sort of drag their feet and prevent it from happening in 2024?
What they wanted to do is get more information from the State Board of Elections. They were also trying to get more information from the General Assembly about what went into passing this law and the implementation. And that flies in the face of the way the courts operate. This was a lawsuit filed in 2018. It was supposed to go to trial in 2021, but because of some other legal shenanigans, it was delayed. But the discovery in the case ended in 2020. And all of the other parties except the plaintiffs said, we ought to stick with that record. And the plaintiffs wanted to open it back up, get a lot more information from the General Assembly, do interviews, talk to the State Board of Elections, and everyone else. And everyone else in the case said, no, we're not going to do this. And one of the arguments that the legislature made about not reopening it is, if that happened, you would not have this case decided before the 2024 elections, and you would just cause all kinds of confusion among voters about whether they would need voter ID in 2024.
Very interesting. Okay, so going back to Allison Riggs, she made an accelerated path through these careers because of Cooper's appointments, right?
Yeah, she did. She jumped from one court, now she's jumped to the other, and she didn't get elected.
To North Carolina Supreme Court. Has she been elected to any of these?
No. No. There was actually a funny tweet that was put out this week that she's the Gerald Ford of the court system in North Carolina. You know, it's just amazing how she has, climbed the ladder without getting elected for these positions.
Right. Now this seat will be on the ballot
yes.
In 2024, if I understand correctly.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, very interesting. Yep. We'll be following that closely. What are your thoughts?
Jumping back to Mike Morgan, I thought this was a little bit interesting because there'd been some speculation as to whether he'd get in the governor's race, and if he did, up against Stein, whether or not Cooper would endorse Stein or if he'd have to stay out of it.
Right.
After Morgan announced, I believe this was the timeline, after Morgan announced that he was stepping down from his seat amidst speculation he was going to jump into the governor's race, Cooper went ahead and endorsed Stein.
Right.
And then on top of that, Morgan had wanted to choose his predecessor, or successor, I should say.
Okay.
And it was not Allison Riggs, it was a different lady, I can't remember her name.
Oh.
But Cooper chose Allison Riggs instead and did not honor Morgan's wishes in that regard either. So I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting because it's going to be up for grabs again in 24 anyway. Didn't really cost him anything.
That's right. So I don't know what was going on behind the scenes there, but it doesn't seem like Cooper and Morgan are super aligned.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. And Earl's current Associate Justice and Allison Riggs are very close, from what I understand.
That's what I've heard as well.
They used to work together.
Yeah,
they worked together at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Riggs has been described as Earl's protege.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Very interesting. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. Maybe there's a split. You can never really tell with something like that. But I mean, Stein, I don't think it necessarily. Dallas said it does help a party to have that kind of intense primary because it can bring a lot of attention. But maybe Cooper and Stein and their inner circle we're hoping that would just be the primary for Democrat for governor would be a little smoother, and Morgan, by stepping down from the court, and he's just kind of causing confusion and unnecessary battle there.
Do you think there's a split going on between, say, progressives and the traditional North Carolina Democratic Party?
There might be. I mean, there are some, at some level, especially among African American males, actually, you see them emerging at the legislature as sort of a swing vote. Almost all of the Democrats that will sometimes vote with Republicans on certain issues. It's hard to tell with somebody like Mike Morgan what his politics are because the Judicial Standards Commission, I believe, there's not a lot that they can say about their positions on things.
Right.
So I don't know where he would stand in that kind. But there are some splits that you saw on votes with a couple people on issues like school choice and also some of the transgender issues. You saw some people breaking with the more mainstream of the Democratic Party, which is starting to head more left on social issues and things of that nature.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about that?
I was going to say that Stein and Cooper have the same team of advisors, Morgan Jackson and that crowd. Stein is trying to follow the same path as Cooper, go from attorney general to governor. But
AG is almost governor. I think that's what I heard. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people have said that. Mike Easley had that role too.
Sure.
But I think that one of the things that we have seen very clearly is that Stein is not Cooper, and that other Democrats don't view Stein as the next Cooper. I think there are a lot of people who support him, but I think there are a lot of people who aren't as thrilled with Stein as they are with Cooper. And so I think we probably see that playing out in the ability of someone like Mike Morgan to step in.
Mark Robinson, who's kind of leading the way on the Republican side for governor, said he's not the next Roy Cooper, he's the next Gavin Newsom.
Yes.
Was that right?
Yes.
I believe I saw that.
That was right.
So I do think that's an interesting comparison there, because obviously Newsom is this far left California governor, and Cooper has staked himself out as being a little bit more moderate, although I'd maybe debate that recently. But
Sure. Do you think Mike Morgan really came out strong? He's like, I can win.
Yeah.
Is that the issue? Maybe that's what Democrats are worried about. Like, who can win versus who's aligned with Cooper, who's getting the money from out of state, who's in state, because he's born in Cherry Point, grew up in New Bern, North Carolina guy.
They may be looking at the results of Josh Stein's 2 statewide elections. They were both very close.
Sure.
When he first won election, it was very close. When he beat Jim O'Neill after basically lying about the rape kits being untested, that was a very close race as well. And so I think some people are looking at those numbers and saying, this is not the same shoe-in as Roy Cooper running for governor. Maybe we need to have an alternative.
Very interesting. We'll be watching this really closely as we go into 2024. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. A report on pricing transparency in hospitals. We've all had those surprise bills. You go in for what you think is going to be a routine surgery, and it's a major bill. Tell me what's been going on with the Treasurer's office.
Sure. So there was a new report this week Treasurer Folwell put out. He had researchers at Johns Hopkins do some research into just 3 different levels on this report. One's hospital transparency about finding the prices, calling up and asking what the prices are. Also, wide disparity between prices for hospitals, and also pricing as far as the Medicare model. So for price transparencies, you're looking at, 51% of hospitals in North Carolina have been transparent with prices, according to this report. Disparities between hospitals, you could go for, they listed an example of a gallbladder surgery. It could be like $1,300 in one hospital, could be as much as $13,000 in another.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah.
Sure.
It gives all the different breakdowns of all different common, things you go into the hospital for, different surgeries, different testing. Yeah, it's just amazing, the disparities for that. And as far as for Medicare, the worst that they found in this report was for testing like MRIs, CAT scans. It just varies so wildly, and that's tied to the con laws that we have in the state.
Certificate of need, yes.
Correct, certificate of need, in case we say exactly what that is. And also Treasurer Folwell said he has a date in the North Carolina Supreme Court coming up. He's on the calendar to argue this. So it's very important, he mentions that, and also there's so many, we're all affected by this.
Yeah, of course.
We're all affected by this. People are getting liens put on their homes, courts are suing. He makes a point in this report.
It's about consumer protection is what he's
Consumer
arguing.
protection, right. In fact,
Yeah.
the Medical De-Weaponization Act is something he alluded to. He says if that passed, it's in the legislature, we would become the second best state in the country for consumer protection.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Mitch, tell me about this certificate of need and what we're seeing in the courts. It's something people have been arguing about for a long time, something John Locke Foundation has been really arguing for.
Yeah, exactly. The certificate of need is basically a government permission slip that healthcare providers need if they want to build a new hospital, expand an existing hospital,
Okay.
buy a major piece of medical equipment, open some sort of ambulatory surgery center.
Sure.
Basically, the government of the state decides when and where that can happen.
A competition, right.
Well, it's a competition for government approval rather
Right.
than a real competition.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that happen in recent years. There are some ongoing fights between Duke, UNC, and Wake Med in the Triangle over adding 40 beds.
Right.
When, why don't we just let them all add 40 beds if they wanted
Sure.
to and see where people want to go? Basically, it's the government saying, no, you'll get to add 40 beds and you can't. That's the type of thing that contributes to all of this problem that we see with healthcare, the lack of transparency, the lack of availability of supply, because the government is putting its thumb on the availability of so many of these things.
Sure, sure. Now, he mentioned Medical De-Weaponization Act. Alex, where does that stand in the
That's right.
legislature?
So that bill passed the state Senate unanimously, I believe.
Okay.
But it's currently sitting in House Rules, and I don't know that it'll move forward. I haven't heard anything on that
There's
front.
so much going on right there.
That's right. It might get wrapped up in negotiations. It might just be dead. Maybe it'll come back in the
Sure,
short session.
Sure. David, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so today actually we're publishing an article, or somebody from Help Advisor, which is, they do studies on a variety of things, but on medical debt. And they looked at all the states, but they reached out to me about publishing something because they found that the top two states in the counties in the country for medical debt were Lenore County and Greene County in North Carolina.
In the country?
In the country, and 9 of the top 18 counties in the country for medical debt were in North Carolina.
Wow.
Wow.
And so their recommendation was passing the Medical De-Weaponization Act. But I think, yeah, a lot of it's price transparency, because you can imagine if you go, to buy a car or
Sure.
something, and then you're like, oh, you just have to buy. Sometimes with medical things, you don't.
Yeah.
You just have to do
You
it.
can't not do it,
But if
yeah.
you don't know until after, it's like, oh yeah, that Honda Civic is $300,000, but
Right.
you would have known up front. And also, I think the hospitals, operating as nonprofits is, they do that for tax purposes, but they're pretty for-profit in a lot of their motives.
Right.
So that kind of, if we're in a free market kind of system and it's a for-profit and they're going with all of the normal things that entails,
Sure.
you would think there'd be more transparency and more. There can be competition between. I think getting rid of CON is obviously a good way to add competition too.
Right.
But they're sort of operating in a gray zone a lot of this with their nonprofit and for-profit and.
Sure. Sure, and that column will be on carolinajournal.com here shortly. Now, you did hear back from the North Carolina Healthcare Association, which represents North Carolina hospitals. They've been really targeted in this process. They've been pushing hard for Medicaid expansion, which is in the budget, but they've also gotten a lot of heat for pricing transparency. What do they have to say?
Yeah, so they said, there is pricing transparency among hospitals in North Carolina. They pointed to another study that came out in July, saying they're among the North Carolina's hospitals are among the top 10 for pricing transparency, and they're not the rate makers. They don't have leverage as far as negotiating prices. They just have to list the prices that they're given. That's what they were arguing. One other really quick note with this study too, a lot of consumer advocates, you'll hear that, if you pay a cash price, you're going to get a better discount on going into the hospital. This report found that is not the case. In fact, you get charged a higher price, which was very shocking to me because I
that
listened.
hits the hardest hurt.
Exactly. Those are uninsured, or maybe you think you're going to try to save money even though you have some insurance. Those people faced even higher charges for paying in cash.
That is alarming.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, that's about all the time we have. We're certainly going to be watching what's unfolding down at the legislature and the executive branch. Lots of news going on. So please follow carolinajournal.com and like and subscribe to this show. We'll be bringing it to you each week. It's great to have you with us, and thanks for tuning in.